Yes, in my opinion, the greatest progressive rock band in all history, and as well as its awesome music and John Anderson's cosmic lyrics, another thing that defines Yes in general is their album covers. This is the story of the Yes album covers. The first Yes album would come out in 1969 simply to be called Yes, and its logo would consist of the word Yes itself on a black background. And this is a tradition they would later return to. We would see this on the Talk album, Open Your Eyes. You can argue a little bit on Magnification. Even the front of Close to the Edge, if you like, even though the inside of it does have some Roger Dean logos. However, depending on which version you got of the first two Yes albums, Yes or Time in a Word, if you were to get the US versions, both of these would consist of the band members at the forefront on a location which featured Steve Howe, which is hilarious because he wasn't even in the band on this album. This would also be something that they would return to for the Yes album, which only had one cover. And if you think of it, depending on which covers you had, you have to imagine now that the first three albums only consisted of the band members themselves being at the front of the cover, and this would be something that eventually would leave behind. I don't know if maybe that tradition got a little bit old-fashioned, and maybe as their music was becoming more broader and they were moving away from conventional ways of doing things, perhaps they wanted to expand and look at different ways of doing things, and maybe look at how the artwork could also bring you into the world of the music. Or rather, the music would take you into the world of the artwork, depending on which way you looked at it. Of course, Yes was formed in the late 1960s and into the early 70s, and so we still have that psychedelic influence within the music culture at that time. And I think if you look at the first two album covers, the UK releases of Yes and Time in a Word, you can certainly see that psychedelic influence, you know, where you have abstract images and the colours are contrasting with each other, and I suppose that was a major influence wanting to get into their artwork. A similar trend that we would see with other bands like Cream and Jimi Hendrix. Both these albums came out in '67, so I imagine that way of doing album covers was very popular at that time. But as probably the music scene was changing as we get into the '70s, they probably were looking for ways, well, how can we make this even bigger and how can we expand this even more? Well, as the 70s were progressing, we get into 71, and Tony Kaye had left the band, and the band was still wanting to expand their horizon. They brought Steve Howe in with his sort of neoclassical influence, and then of course Rick Wakeman came along with his classical influence, and then the band was just getting bigger and bigger within their musicality. Then of course they would discover Roger Dean at that time. The band were in the studio, and Roger Dean asks would a band be interested in this image that they have, which of course was the Fragile cover, and someone suggested, why don't you ask this band Yes downstairs? And of course on the Fragile album, this would be the first time we would see the Roger Dean ship logo, which is quite large on the Fragile cover, but then we would also see it on the inside sleeve of the credits of each album. And I believe it's on most of them. It's inside Topographic Oceans, it's inside Drama, or sometimes it's on the back sleeve of some of the albums. And that's how the beginning of Roger Dean started, and then from there he was involved on the next four albums after that. The inside sleeve of Close to the Edge, Topographic Oceans, and of course Relayer. And these would be a big artistic vision for Yes at this time, with Roger Dean's influence, and especially if you listen to Relayer with the music symbolizing a battle, the cover really brings that out much more. Close to the Edge would also introduce the famous Roger Dean Yes logo, which we would see almost consistently throughout the history of Yes. And the Yes logo has gone through some different changes over the years. First we begin with the bubble writing Yes, and then we get the Roger Dean Yes, and then of course we would get the 90s Yes, which was in the square shaped form that we would see on the ladder, for example. Now, the US release of the first Yes album would be the first time ever where the band was actually standing in a physical location on planet Earth and not within the awesome world that Roger Dean created. And there's quite a few debates about where that location is. It's believed it's in Fulham in London somewhere, but I'm intending to do a longer video on that, as sometimes the band would actually go to a location and shoot the cover, or they would also take images from real life locations and incorporate it within the album cover. And we would see this in Topographic Oceans, for example, where we have the Mayan Temple, which is in Mexico, and that too, along with the music of Topographic Oceans, I suppose, was symbolizing the psychedelic and religious side of things that Jon Anderson was really exploring at the time with the band. Inside the sleeve of Topographic Oceans, there's also a couple of images that look like they're taken. They look like they're taken, from this earth and this life, and they look like they're real locations, but mostly of the sky, to be honest. But I suppose it would be difficult to find those actual locations, but there you are. And then of course we would also see this with the Go In For The One album as well. Although it's a graphic design, those buildings there are influenced from the Century Towers in Los Angeles, which is interesting considering they have a song called Turn of the Century on the album. And another interesting fact is that that's just a couple of blocks down from the Fox Plaza, better known as the Die Hard building. And then they would do this method once again on the Tomato album, and that rock there is actually called Yes Tor, which is in Dartmoor, England. And I'm assuming they saw the name Yes Tor, we're called Yes, we'll use that exact same location. And then they have the man standing in front, and it's believed that I think Rick threw the tomato at the album cover, because that was what basically the band thought of the album at the time. Well, the last time we would hear from Roger Dean at the end of that very successful period for Yes in the late 70s would be the Drama album, which of course is when Jon Anderson and Rick Wakeman had left and the Buggles had come in, and this would be another really cool album cover. Well, as well as the main studio albums, of course, there's also the live albums. We would see Roger Dean come back for the Yes Songs album, and there's lots of different artwork within that one when you open it up, and the theme of the floating islands like we see in Close to the Edge is repeated in that one. We also see him on the Yesterdays album cover and on the Yes Shows, the live album cover, and also we would see him on the classic Yes album cover, which was the compilation album, I believe, after Drama, while the band was split up. I believe the Yes Shows eagle also shows up quite a couple of times on some of the different albums, or the shape of a bird or eagle seems to be quite consistent within Roger Dean's artwork. Some of the things I think that are quite consistent with Roger Dean's artwork within Yes is seeing a body of water. We see that quite frequently, and also seeing mountain ranges. And he also incorporates a lot of animals such as birds and fish, whereas in Asia you see more epic animals like dragons, for example. Even though we do get the awesome snake at the on the front cover of Relaya. And then of course after that, Yes would split up for a couple of years, and they were kind of searching about what was their next phase, how would they now enter the world of the 1980s, and then they met up with Trevor Rabin and brought Tony Kaye back and Jon Anderson back, and would now begin the 90125 album. And I suppose the two albums in the 80s with Trevor Rabin, 90125 and Big Generator, you could say would almost go back to that first tradition of the first Yes album, where they would just show the logo on the front of the cover with no sort of landscape or location within the album. It's a very computer-generated graphic design cover, which we would see this again on the Talk album. And it's a different era for the band now, and of course the music is slightly different to compare to that of the 70s, and maybe you could argue that the album covers went away from what they were trying to do in the 70s because it was a new direction. Of course, they would return to this. So in '89, we have the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman and Howe album, which is not an official Yes album, but nevertheless it's the original members who came back, and they brought Roger Dean on board with this as well. I imagine maybe to bring that sort of nostalgic, bring the old days back of Yes, I imagine. And of course when Yes would all come back together on the Union album, we would again see another Roger Dean cover, a really cool one on the Union album. And then with the Talk album, again, it's just the Yes logo. And although it's a different format, it does very much remind me of the first Yes album cover when you compare them in comparison. And then we would bring Roger Dean back on board again for the two Keys to Ascension albums. But when we get to Open Your Eyes, again, we just have the front logo again, very much like the first album and the Talk album. And then Roger Dean would now come back in the late 90s for the Ladder album. And this would also bring in the square Yes logo, which of course, this is not unique because we see this logo on the Yes Years and this box set. For example, we see that square logo which came out in 91 during the Union tour time, where we would incorporate all of the logos on the album cover. And that also, of course, would bring the square Yes logo into existence, which, as far as I recall, we don't see that prior to this time. Then in 2001, the band would actually depart from Roger Dean again and bring in Bob Cesar, I believe you say his name, for the Magnification album, which again has sort of that psychedelic sci-fi influence to it. And it's strange to think actually that this would be the last studio album we would hear from Jon Anderson, because yes, although they toured into the early 2000s, they would later change Jon Anderson and get some other singers in. But then Roger Dean would come back then for the very recent time of Yes, which would be Fly From Here in 2011 and then Heaven and Earth in 2014, both of which have different singers, and neither of them are Jon Anderson, although I believe Trevor Horn produced Fly From Here, which of course was one of the songs back from the Drama demos actually. So, do I have a favourite Yes album cover, and do I have a least favourite? Well, I think for me, probably Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman and Howe is high on there. However, if you wanted me to keep it to strictly Yes within the Yes logo, I suppose Relaya would be really high up there. And then my least favourite would probably be the Yes album. Actually, I find it very dark and there is nothing really exciting about it, although musically it's a great album. So do you have a favourite Yes album cover or a least favourite? And that is the story of the Yes album covers. Please subscribe to my video if you enjoyed this, and I'll be intending to do some more videos on Yes in general. So thanks a lot, and see you around.